Good day, nerds, and welcome to Cantina Conversation with Cory Doctorow. Here at the beginning of the episode, I'm going to introduce Cory and who he is, and he's going to have an opportunity to talk. So I'm not going to waste time now doing that. What I will just say is, if you're listening to this intro, this episode is worth sticking around. Regardless of what you're into, the things that we're going to talk about today with monopolies, digital rights, the internet space, and what's protecting us out there and what's failing to protect us are important to us all. So stick around, take a listen, hopefully have your eyes opened a little bit to some of the things that are going on, as we are incredibly honored to be joined by the best-selling author and activist, Cory Doctorow.
Calling back all nerds. Nerds!
Thanks for joining us for this really great conversation we are going to have here with Cory Doctorow. So for those of you who did not listen to the first interview that the Nerd Cantina had with Cory and are not familiar with his work, Cory is a science fiction author, an activist, a journalist, blogger. He does everything. He's the co-editor of Boing Boing. He's been the author of science fiction novels like Little Brother, its follow-on Homeland, most recently Radicalized. And he was also at one point the European director for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, is still conducting work through there. And overall, just an activist in the tech space, digital rights management, and some of the things that we're going to go over today. So Cory, thank you very much for your time.
Oh, well, thank you very much. It's absolutely my pleasure. Thanks for having me back on.
Where I'd like to start the interview is last time you were on, Steve got you at C2E2 and really focused on Radicalized and a conversation. What I'd like to know is maybe something that you don't talk about as much, where your start in tech comes from. I understand you could maybe say you were almost kind of born into a perfect situation there.
Yeah, well, I always say when I meet young people who want to know how to get started in the tech industry, that really what it takes is a lot of like hard work and foresight, especially the hard work and foresight to be born in 1971. And frankly, if you don't have the gumption to be born in 1971, there's not much we can do for you. Being born in 1971 meant that in 1977, my dad, who was a computer scientist and programmer, who, he's been at it for so long that his first computer science degree is actually an applied mathematics degree because they didn't have computer degrees back then. He started to bring home dumb terminals, teletype terminals, basically a giant roll of paper, and a keyboard and a thing that you hang your phone up into after you dial into the PDP mainframe at the university. And so I got my start programming in BASIC and hanging out on little message boards and doing that kind of thing back then. And then in 79, my dad was the head of computer science at a big high school in Toronto, and Apple had the foresight to give everyone who was teaching computer science back then a free Apple II Plus for the summer, the first really successful, fully assembled home PC.
Yeah.
And we kept that, got a modem, and I became a self-taught programmer. There were some computer science classes and summer camps and things, but they were pretty basic, and in both the literal and figurative sense. We were learning to program in BASIC for the most part. and that led me into doing several partial computer science degrees. I got a semester or two of artificial intelligence at the University of Toronto, and then I did a big genetic algorithm self-study program at the University of Waterloo, and then I dropped out to be a CD-ROM programmer in the dawn of CD-ROMs, and as they became kind of successful and then cratered, I became a Gopher developer and then a web developer, and then I started a software company. And this was during the dot-com bubble, so we raised $19 million. I moved to San Francisco to open our Bay Area office. Our investors decided that because the market was cratering and because we had an acquisition offer from Microsoft, that was the perfect time to steal as much of the equity as possible from the founders. They actually cost my co-founder his house as a result. And they were kind of thinking that like we would be so motivated by any potential upside that we would come back and help oversee that. And I kind of took a good hard look in the mirror and said, fuck this, and quit the company I co-founded and went to work for Electronic Frontier Foundation. And the acquisition deal cratered. The investors got nothing. And here I am.
Would you say that was being that it was so early on in tech, that your upbringing it was somewhat of a lonely endeavor. Did you have many of your peers that even understood what you were doing at that young of an age with computers, or were you kind of on your own figuring these things out?
There was definitely like a split among my peers between the ones who were really into it and the ones for whom it was like more instrumental. They just, like playing video games or whatever. But, I had a real crowd, even in elementary school, that I ran around with. We would literally bring our Apple II Pluses over to each other's houses to play on the modems and dial around. And, one of the kids I went to school with in Toronto, in this weird little alternative school, was a kid named Timmy Wu, who grew up to be Tim Wu, the law professor who coined the term network neutrality, and was at the FTC for a while, and was then ran for lieutenant governor of New York under Zephyr Truthout, and is now one of the leading thinkers in pro-competition, anti-monopoly thought, and particularly when it comes to Facebook, but also Google and the other tech giants.
Wow.
Well, that's great. And then I understand you also had a pretty early influence as becoming a writer, because you could have very easily just entrenched in tech, but the sci-fi aspect and your desire to kind of put your thoughts in writing started pretty early as well, correct?
Oh, yeah, that's true. I mean, it was, again, like some of that is down to upbringing. My dad was a science fiction nerd, and he's very political. He's a Trotskyist, which is a very exotic kind of communist. And when I was a kid, my dad would tell me the Conan stories that he sort of half remembered from the comics and Elsbrag de Camp and Robert Howard books he'd grown up on. But he would change Conan to this trio called Harry, Larry, and Mary, who are committed to justice struggles. And when they deposed the Grand Vizier and foiled his plot, they would establish workers' cooperatives. But I used to hang out with my dad when my mom was going to teachers college. They're both teachers, and on, I think it was Tuesday nights, they would show Welcome Back, Kotter, and then they, on TV Ontario, which was our public broadcaster, they would show Doctor Who. And Doctor Who back then was always introduced by this incredible writer and editor and critic, science fiction, doyen called Judith Merrill. And Judy had been married to Frederick Pohl, another great of the field. And after the Chicago police riots in 1968, she went into voluntary exile from the U.S. She couldn't stomach American politics anymore and moved to Toronto and took up with this group called Rochdale, who were this commune that William Gibson was a part of. And she hosted the show on TV Ontario, and she started the science fiction library. She donated her and Pohl's collection, to the Toronto Public Library System, and started what was then called the Spaced Out Library, is now called the Merrill Collection, and which became the largest science fiction reference collection in a public library in the world. And, I grew up going down there. They used to have this program where Judy was the writer in residence, and she would read your manuscripts. You could just like get on the subway and go down to Spadina and Bloor back when it was housed there, and give her a manuscript. She'd read it and give you feedback. I mean, this is a bit like, being a budding filmmaker and being able to just go and like hang out with Kubrick when you're 12,
that's
and
amazing.
show him your Super 8 movies.
Yeah.
And more than that, she would combine the writers who she thought would be good for each other in writing workshops that they would self-direct. And so when I was maybe 15 or 16, she hooked me up with Carl Schrader, and then with a larger group of people called the Cecil Street Irregulars, which now includes Peter Watts and Madeline Ashby and a number of other writers. And, so I had that writing group. And then Toronto is also the home to the oldest remaining science fiction bookstore in the world. It was then called Baca Books and is now called Baca Phoenix Books. And it always employed science fiction writers, including Tanya Huff, T.S. Huff, who, again, was super kind to me as a kid and a budding writer. And she would let me come down with my manuscripts and show them to her and give me critiques. And when, she sold me the first science fiction book I ever bought for myself, I went in on a school trip. And she asked me what kind of stuff I liked reading from the library, and I told her, and she said, "I think you'd like Little Fuzzy by H. Beam Piper," and found me a $1 used copy in the used section at the back. And when she quit to write full time, I got her job. So I ended up working there as well. And that was the hub of another part of Toronto's science fiction community, which also included Prisoners of Gravity, which was the greatest science fiction digest show ever. The Mark Asquith and Greg Thirlbeck and this group of really smart producers would go to science fiction conventions and record interviews with Harlan Ellison and Neil Gaiman and Joe Lansdale and, Connie Willis and always Judith Merrill. And they would piece together these thematic shows. And I was a consultant on the show because they used to come over and ask us what was good and what they should be paying attention to and so on. And then I was a frequent guest on the show as I started selling. So I really kind of grew up in the right milieu for it. And I haven't even talked about how the high school that I went to had a writing workshop that Judith Merrill had founded through a Writers in the School program. And although she wasn't involved with it, it was still going and it was still running on the principles that she'd set up. And so, I was just like really in the right place at the right time for that stuff.
I think you successfully just sold a lot of people on Toronto.
Yeah, it was it still is a great city. The Merrill collection is still going strong, although Toronto has both a mayor and a premier, which is the Canadian equivalent of a governor, who are far right assholes who want to gut funding for the library system, and they're always in peril and worrying about their imminent demise. Ontario's new premier is the brother of Rob Ford, the infamous crackhead who was mayor of Toronto for some years, and whose entire election platform was vote for me and beer will cost $1 in the state stores again, and I won't let them teach butt stuff in sex ed in high school anymore. And on that twin set of planks, he was elected. He makes his brother look like the smart one. And it has been just a catastrophe for Ontario politics. I mean, he's in the same way that like Bolsonaro and Duterte and these other sort of Trump-alikes in some ways are even more horrifying than Trump. He is also just an absolute horror. He's really proof that there's a group of people who would vote for roadkill if it promised to reduce their taxes by 50 cents.
Yeah. Well, and just like that, you've now made Toronto less desirable. But
yeah, well, you know what? The lesson here, and I told this to all my American friends after the 2016 election, having just left the UK ahead of Brexit, is that there's no safe haven, right? No. This is like, Trump is not smart enough to be a cause. He's an effect. And he is an effect of a global change that kind of dovetails with some of the stuff I think we're going to talk about today, the competition and inequality. And he is and so this is everywhere. There's nowhere you can escape it.
Yeah, it's just a manifestation.
You're almost destined to be kind of an author of this time in this sci-fi tech space and really making some captivating stories and dystopian novels that are extremely accessible and great, like Little Brother, the short stories and Radicalized, that are bringing to light some extremely important issues and hopefully getting people to reframe their mindset on how they're even thinking about their future. One of the books that I wanted to introduce, because I think it can kind of put us down a path of some discussion, is your book. I believe it was in 2014, The Information Doesn't Want to Be Free, Laws for the Internet Age. And for us to kind of have a 2019 discussion around your 3 laws, so for our audience who may not know them, maybe go one by one and break them down, and then talk about how they relate a bit to what we're talking about today.
Yeah. So the laws are: never play poker with a man named Tex. Always keep a trash bag in your car. No, I'm just kidding. So the 3 laws, the first one is anytime someone puts a lock on something that belongs to you and does not give you the key, that lock is not there for your benefit. And that's advice for creators who find themselves in this increasingly monopolized space where the major vendors, be they Apple or Amazon or Google, want to lock your creative work in a digital rights management format, a proprietary format that's against the law to reverse engineer or to break, which means that your customers, the people who like your work, will not be able to follow you if you break with that vendor and switch to someone else. So, if you're an Audible reader, every dollar you spend on Audible is $1 you have to forfeit if you decide you want to use a rival's service. And what that means for artists is that they are increasingly themselves locked into these services, which means that even if you like the deal the service is offering you now, you have to understand that that deal is not there because the firm is made up of good-natured slobs who want to make sure that you get a fair price for your creative work. It's there because it's what they think they need to give you in order to get your work through the door. And if they get the chance to squeeze you, they will. And you can see that, for example, with Apple and the iOS platform, you know, the iPads and the iPods and the iPhones, where the App Store, when it launched, had a 30% VIG, where they would skim 30% of the money that software vendors made from selling their software to Apple customers. And, you know, those devices are designed so that you can only download software from Apple's store, which meant that if you wanted to sell to Apple customers, you had to go through the store. And at first, the store was offering pretty attractive terms to software vendors because you know, the corollary, the other side of the sword here is if there's only one store that you can buy software from for your Apple device, then that store had better have some pretty good software. Otherwise, there's no reason to buy an Apple device. But as soon as they started to dominate, they switched the deal. And the deal switched from 30% of any upfront costs that Apple got from, or that you got from your customer when they signed up to be your customer, to 30% of the lifetime revenue generated by that customer. That is a really big difference, right?
Yes.
It's the difference between like a commission and a permanent take. And so you need to understand that if a company doesn't let you opt out of this lock-in, right? They'll say that it's there to fight piracy or some other excuse. But if they won't let you opt out, then you have to understand that this is not there to protect you. It's there to protect them from you, right? From you switching to one of their rivals. The second law is that you can't eat fame, but no one will pay you for your stuff if they haven't heard of you. And so we have these intermediaries like YouTube and Twitter and Tumblr and Facebook and so on. And they are platforms for connecting artists and audiences. And although some of them have some monetization paths, you know, YouTube has its built-in ads and so on, oftentimes they are not great. And even when they seem great at first, they're subject to that sliding scale where things might get worse later on. But the thing to remember is that you can't extract revenue from your customers for your creative work if you can't reach them. And so anything that we contemplate to help artists that locks in these platforms as the only way to reach your audience ends up hurting you. So, for example, in the European Union, they just passed by 5 votes a new copyright rule that says that if you operate a platform like YouTube, you have to operate a copyright filter that allows anyone to upload anything, claim it as their copyright with no evidence, and then forces the platforms to block anything that matches anything in the filter. So that means that people could claim your work, they could claim works in the public domain, like, you know, the alphabet or Shakespeare. It means that if your work includes fair use of other people's work, if you make reaction videos, that your work won't go live because the filter will catch it. But most importantly, it means that only companies with hundreds of millions of dollars to build these filters can compete to be online platforms, to be intermediaries. And that means that you are going to be increasingly beholden to them. They will become indistinguishable from the big platforms. You know, for example, YouTube used to compete with the streaming audio services and with the labels. And then they launched their own streaming audio service and they gathered the labels to them and they said, okay, we're going to pay you a license fee for YouTube Music. Let's hammer out what that deal is. And then they went to everybody else who uploaded music to the platforms and they said, if you want to use YouTube, you have to take the deal that the big 4 record labels negotiated, even if that's not a deal that's good for you. And so they became effectively an adjunct of the big 4 record labels. And the big 4 record labels are not friends to artists, right? When we talk about how Spotify streams don't pay much to artists, what we really mean is that of the billions of dollars Spotify hands to record labels, only pennies reach the artists. And so making the labels stronger ends up hurting the recording artists. And then the last law is that information doesn't want to be free, but people sure do, right? Information doesn't want anything. Anthropomorphizing the wishes of abstractions gets us nowhere. But, the internet is not primarily an entertainment medium. It is like a digital nervous system for our species. And it's where all the important stuff happens. Romance and family life, employment, education, political and civil discourse. If you think that someone's going to challenge that politician who's driving you crazy, but they can't use the internet to do it, you better get used to being disappointed, because without the internet, they will not get elected. And so anything that we do that weakens the fabric of the internet, for example, making it easy to censor things by claiming copyright infringement without having to prove it and without any penalties for false claims, just weakens that whole fabric altogether. And what it ends up doing is making the needs of the entertainment industry the most critical or salient factor about how we regulate the nervous system that binds our species together. So those are the three rules.
Well, I'd like to step back and try to apply some of these thoughts to, I guess, some other things, like your first law about things that you own being placed behind a lock, and you're talking about it from a creator standpoint. But this is also having a significant effect as we move more into digital consumerism. That these same locks are almost used to trap us into being kind of perpetual downstream customers within that same product. That digital ownership, while we're purchasing things and we claim ownership of a book, of a song, or whatever else, what we really only own is the right to continue to play it on that specific service. We can't really move it to other things, and it kind of plays into that some talks you've had recently even about interoperability and the fact that we lack our ability to truly own anything.
Yeah, we had recently spoke on the show about a case where was it PlayStation? PlayStation kicked a user off their network for hate speech. But when they also kicked him off the network, he lost thousands of dollars of video games that he purchased because they claim that they have the right to the digital copyright over him. That basically, essentially, PlayStation is telling him he didn't buy the game; he's leasing it. And
yeah,
so that's kind of the story that we ran on our new show, and we feel that this applies, very much to that case. How do we as consumers also protect ourselves in these situations?
Yeah, I was going to say that I actually think that you're being too generous to the platforms, because you don't buy the right to listen to it on that platform or use it on that platform. You buy the right to listen to it or use it on that platform until they change their mind. Right? Until for example, Amazon takes all the Christmas movies out of Prime every Christmas, so you have to buy them. Right? You can watch them for free in July, but not in December. And so, that right is very contingent. I mean, much more seriously, Microsoft had an ebook program, and they decided that they didn't want to continue it because it wasn't making any money for them, and decided to just shut down the DRM server. And they said, well, if we can find you when we make your books stop working, we will refund you the price of the book. Mm-hmm. Right? Well, as I said, I was a bookseller, and it didn't matter what happened. Under any circumstances, I was not allowed to come over to your house and take the books back after I sold them to you. And it didn't really matter if I left the money under your pillow when I did it, right? They were your books. They belonged to you. You got to use them however you wanted. And that's the real crisis here, is not only are you buying a constrained set of rights, but those rights are subject to change without notice, right? That to assess whether or not, for example, like the iTunes music you're buying is a deal that you're comfortable with, you not only have to be able to review and understand the fine print and like some sprawling garbage novella of legalese, right? But you also have to be able to divine the internal workings of the boardroom to learn whether or not those rights that you think you're buying today will persist tomorrow. iTunes at one point sold songs that you could stream from any Mac to any other Mac, and then one day they decided that was a problem, and they changed it from any Mac to any Mac on your subnet. So if you had bought a bunch of music to put on a music server that you would then stream from when you were on the road, suddenly it stopped working. Amazon famously sold ebooks that had a read aloud function turned on in them, so you could do text to speech. So if you bought that because your kid had a reading disability, maybe they have dyslexia, or if you bought it because you have a visual impairment, or just because you like to flip back and forth between text to speech and text, maybe you're learning English. You buy the books on day one and they've got 5 features, and on day 2 they've got 4. And the only way to have predicted that is to have been in the boardroom with the product managers when they were thinking about what those constraints were going to be.
Well, and also as a consumer, you feel that technology is supposed to be working for us. So, as I buy a digital video game, I'm saying to myself, it's a one less plastic case that's going to end up in a landfill, one less disc that they have to produce. And with all these things happening, with losing the cost of having to produce discs and artwork for the cases and things like that, pricing still hasn't gone down. With the overhead going down of these products. We had mentioned on the show a couple weeks ago that we found it odd that if you wanted to rent a movie from Amazon or Microsoft on any of these systems, that it's like $5-6, yet Redbox will give you the disc. They have actual overhead to compensate for machines, discs, and they'll give it to you for $1.
They'll physically move an object, a packet of atoms into your premises for less money.
Yes.
Yeah.
So as technology is making everything easier for us as consumers, and better for the environment and such, is the trade-off giving the actual companies way more control of this? And how do we combat that trade-off, so that it works more for us as consumers again?
So I think it's even worse than you make it out to be. One of the stories that we used to hear about restrictions, like the ones we're talking about, digital rights management and so on, is that it would be cheaper, right? This comes out of an economics school, the University of Chicago economics school, which is also the economics school that gave us the deposing of Salvador Allende in Chile and the murder of 40,000 people, and Chicago law and econ people, they said that there's inefficiencies in only having 2 settings for property. Either you own it or you don't. And that there are a lot of intermediate steps between ownership and not ownership. Like maybe you only want to read a book on a plane, and you don't want the right to read it when you're on the ground. And so somewhere out there, someone is not buying the book because it's not worth it to them, because they only want it for the plane. And if the publisher could guarantee that it wouldn't work on the ground, it would only work on the plane, then they might be willing to offer you a lower price. And then everybody works. It's called the confluence of interests in economic speak. And that you would find, the offer and the price that suits everybody's interests. It's like the difference between having to buy all of your grain wholesale, right? Like you can only buy grain by the silo instead of flour by the sack. And they're like, okay, we can make all these sub offers that will be cheaper. But when you actually look at the market, what you get is less, but the price doesn't go down, right? So Tor Books, who publish my books, they're a division of Macmillan. They're the largest English language science fiction publisher in the world. They used to be the largest in the world, but now there's Chinese publishers that are much larger than them. And Tor, all of their ebooks are DRM free in every platform. And they cost exactly the same as the DRM restricted ones from HarperCollins and Simon & Schuster and Hachette and the other big publishers. And it's very hard to understand why it is that these other publishers are charging the same price for a much more restricted product unless there's no competition, right? Unless the reason they're doing it is because that's what the traffic would bear. And the whole story about offering you less product at less money was just a convenient fiction to justify a bunch of monopolistic tactics, which it turns out I think it was. And so the question as to what we can do about it, well, in an ideal world, if a merchant is offering you a product at a price that's unfair, you get a comparable product from a rival merchant that's better. That's how competition is supposed to work. But we have had no competition to speak of for 40 years. Competition has been in free fall as companies have merged and acquired each other. This is how we ended up with 5 giant websites filled with screenshots from the other 4. And that too can be laid at the feet of the Chicago school. They were all enthralled to this charlatan, a guy named Robert Bork, who, if you're old enough, you'll remember Robert Bork is like pretty much the only guy ever nominated for the Supreme Court that was bounced by the Senate for being too much of a dick to sit on the Supreme Court. Reagan tried it. But Bork has an even bigger legacy than he would have if he'd made it onto the Supreme Court. He made up an entire fictional history of anti-monopoly or antitrust law, where he said if you squint really, really hard at the legislative debates when these laws were enacted, you find that Congress didn't really care about monopolies. They only cared about prices being raised on consumers, and only in the short term. And so as a result, from the Reagan era on, we've allowed much more market concentration than would have been permitted before that. And so we don't really have the kinds of competitive offers that we would hope for. And moreover, because monopolies are very profitable, which is why there were lots of people willing to fund Robert Bork's ideological project to convince judges that this is what Congress meant, because they're so profitable, they're able to spare some of the excess revenues that they get from commanding a monopoly and spend them on lobbying to make it easier for them to do even worse things. And because they're so concentrated, they can lobby together, right? If you remember that photo of all the tech leaders gathering at Trump Tower after Inauguration Day, you know, on the one hand, it was, you know, remarkable and terrible to see them all sitting at a table with Donald Trump. But, you know, take Donald Trump away from that table and it's still terrible because it turns out that everyone who counts in tech fits around a single table. Yeah. Right. And when you all fit around a single table, you can find a confluence of interests.
And that kind of leads us into like the second, your second law, and some of the other issues we want to touch on is, you know, fame won't make you rich, but you have a hard time making money if nobody's heard of you. When you have these monopolies in tech, like the Googles, the YouTubes, the Facebooks, and these are really the only outlets to get your name out there, to, you know, and they control what you see when you see it. How does the antitrust part of the government work into this now that they've gotten so big and they do have this massive amount of control? You know, Google limits you on what you're going to see. You think you type into the search bar and you're asking for all the information in the world, right? I have the internet at my fingertips. I have access to all the information in the world, when in reality, you only have the access to the information that Google wants you to see, the videos that YouTube wants you to see, the businesses that Facebook allows you to see. You know, it's become very monopolistic in just even the information that we're allowed to be privy to. Is it the government's role to break this up? Is it our role as citizens, consumers, to try to take this in our hands?
Well, you know, you can't shop your way out of a monopoly. That's kind of the definition, right? So we've got pretty limited remedies as individuals, but you know, as a collective enterprise, we have more, right? Because lawmakers really do depend on big companies for campaign funding, but they depend on voters. And, you know, one of the things we learned from the SOPA and PIPA fight where they were trying to really horribly screw up the internet and 8 million people called Congress in 72 hours and melted the switchboard is that as hard as it is to get reelected without campaign finance, it's much harder to get reelected without votes. And Congress killed it, right? And so we do have remedies, but those remedies are collective. You know, one of the other things that's happened in 40 years of Reagan ideology is monotonic emphasis on individuals and individual choice and individual agency, and deprecation of collective enterprise. Right? The idea that if the climate change is worrying you, you should really just recycle more is part of the problem, right? Part of the deadlock with climate change. And, you know, if you live in a big city, the biggest contribution you make to climate change is probably the four wheels underneath you when you go to work every morning. And, you know, not even Elon Musk gets to dig his own subway system. That is a collective effort. So we need collective solutions. One of the interesting things that's happened, though, a funny thing that happened on the way to the 21st century, is that the people who were super cool with monopolies because it made their rich buddies even richer woke up one day and realized that, like 6 tech execs get to decide who can speak and who can be heard. And that was great when it was us. But it's not so great now that they're kicking, you know, our friends off. And, you know, that's a lesson that I think that people who had less power had learned a long time ago. You know, that long before Alex Jones got deplatformed, trans activists and activists for the rights of sex workers and activists for indigenous rights and so on had found themselves being deplatformed by the big companies as well. And so, there's this kind of joke that, like, when people get upset about Alex Jones being deplatformed, it's like, first they came for the Nazis and I said nothing because I wasn't a Nazi. But that's not the case, right? First they came for everybody who wasn't a Nazi. No one said anything. Now they've come for the Nazis and Tucker Carlson's up in arms. Can we leverage the fact that he's pissed off to make a weird coalition that fights for competition? And one of the things that's going on in the debate about competition right now is that the big entertainment companies who've historically been adverse to the big tech companies, that not over copyright, that's just the kind of pretense, but because of control, right? They wanted to be in charge of the culture industry and not the platforms, and so they wanted to bring the platforms to heel. And so the big entertainment companies, who are super, super concentrated, as we record this yesterday, CBS Viacom announced that they're going to re-merge and become a single company. Where I'm sitting now in Burbank, I'm just a 15-minute walk from Disney that's about to absorb Fox. And these companies are starting to sing a song about antitrust and monopoly, but only about tech. And to a lesser extent about telecoms, although that's to a much lesser extent because, of course, AT&T and Time Warner have merged and Universal and Comcast have merged. So they're not nearly so worried about telecoms as they are about tech itself. And so, we have these weird alliances, right? Like we have the big entertainment companies worried about market concentration for tech, but not for entertainment. And in an ideal world, what would happen is we would use big tech as the appetizer, and then the main course would be telecoms and entertainment. And there is a risk, right, that we help break up big tech, reduce its lobbying efficiency, and that just makes it harder to break up telecoms and entertainment, but not if it's part of a broader movement. And this is where it gets really cool and interesting, because it turns out that monopolies don't just hurt you if you care about entertainment or tech or telecoms. Monopolies are everywhere, right? So, like, one of the places where monopolies are super manifest is in eyewear. If you wear glasses, it doesn't really matter who manufactured your glasses, right? If they're like Versace, Dolce & Gabbana, if they're Oliver Peoples, if they are any brand you've ever heard of, they're all owned by one company. They're all owned by a company called Luxottica. Luxottica also owns Sunglass Hut and LensCrafters and Target Optical and Sears Optical. They also own the largest lens manufacturer in the world, and they also own the largest eyewear insurer in the world. And since they started doing this stuff, prices have gone up 1,000%. And if you're an eyewear brand that won't sell to them, they refuse to carry you in any of the retailers they own, which is effectively all of the major eyewear retailers, which means that you get driven to your knees and they buy you out. That's how they picked up Oakley for a song. They nearly destroyed Oakley and then bought it for pennies on the dollar. So what that means is that there is a coalition to be formed among people who care about big entertainment. So, the writers in Hollywood right now are on strike against their agents because there are only 4 large agencies. They've all been bought by hedge funds, and they're starting to do deals that screw their own clients in order to make more money for the hedge funds. It matters if you care about eyewear. It matters if you care about energy. It matters if you care about telecoms. It matters if you care about pro wrestling, right? 30 years ago, there were 20 pro wrestling leagues. Now there's one. The guy who owns it is a billionaire. He's a giant Trump supporter. He classes all the wrestlers who wrestle for him as contractors. They're not entitled to health insurance. They're dropping dead in their 50s and begging for money on GoFundMe to pay their medical bills.
And it's interesting you bring that up because there is there's a second group right now that is catching steam that is trying to take on the WWE, and you already see the buying out and the war, kind of the money war that's about to ensue with Vince McMahon trying to eat up his new competition. It's playing out.
Oh, totally.
Right in front of everybody.
And he's got, deep war chest. He can get favorable coverage on the networks, right? He can get exclusive deals on the networks. He can he can hire away the headliners on the other systems and, on the rivals and steal them away and lock them in for long-term contracts. I mean, this is the other piece here, is that this is not a one-shot deal. This is an iterative process. So what we need to do is deprive the monopolists of the excess revenues that they have to pay for lobbying, and then use their weakened power to get laws passed that weaken them further so they have less excess revenues so they can lobby less.
Well,
this is a lather, rinse, repeat deal.
An example I've often used to my friends is whenever the post office budget comes up on the news and everyone says, what do we even need the post office for anyways? Why are we running at a deficit and this and that? I try to tell them, well, watch what happens to the price of shipping a box when only UPS and FedEx run the show.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
that
exactly.
is that if you didn't have at least that post office option, you'd be priced out of shipping a box in the next day, the day after the post office closes. But that's like that's a
the
government.
Post office is
yeah,
but also the USPS is fully funded, right? USPS is fully funded, and the only deficit it has is because we forced them to account for their full pension liability in one go, which no one else in the entire world of business has to do. So they have to have enough money on hand to pay the pensions of people who have yet to retire. Won't retire for 50 years, which there isn't such a pension system in the world. That's just FedEx trying to put them out of business.
Problem, right? Like we can't just create a government-owned business for every sector of these to kind of keep fair competition. So in this age of monopolies, what are the roles of society to try to break this up? Because we can't create a post office version of the phone company so that AT&T and all these carriers have to match, a taxpayer funded version. That's, to me, that's really not the answer, but we have to do something.
I think that's a somewhat unfortunate example because, it turns out that when you survey Americans about their phone companies, the only Americans who are happy with their internet access are ones that are using municipal internet, right? And those municipal internet programs are faster, cheaper, and turn a buck for the people who run them. As I mentioned, I live here in Burbank, and we actually have municipal-owned fiber under the ground. It's amazing. I used to work part-time at Disney as a contractor, and I was on that fiber loop. It's 100 gigabit fiber. It is blazing. But the deal that our city struck with Charter prohibits them from terminating that fiber on any premise that's not zoned commercial, which means that I have to buy my internet from Charter, and it is absolutely atrociously terrible, expensive internet. And the fiber runs under my foundation slab. So, I would, you say, well, we can't have municipal phone companies. I think we can. That is one of the areas where cities are actually really good at doing it, not least because every phone company receives a giant municipal subsidy in the form of rights of way, right? Like if you think about what it would cost to get a license at market clearing rates to dig up every sidewalk in New York City, right? To lay your cable down.
Well, that's why Google Fiber is only really in rural areas. I live outside Chicago. None of these companies are planning on laying new fiber anywhere near a developed area. It's always, in the Midwest, out in these towns where it's easy to still trench in new lines.
Well, and telecom companies don't care there.
Yeah, and when it comes to those muni fiber, the Google Fiber stuff, one of the things that Google Fiber had to head into was that after Google Fiber showed up, telecoms lobbyists in state houses started getting rules passed that prohibited cities from giving Google access to the poles and to the conduit. One of the main reasons that we don't have more municipal fiber is that states across America have adopted at the state level rules prohibiting cities from offering fiber, even when there is no carrier willing to provide broadband to the people within the city limits. And it's even worse at the county level, where you have unincorporated townships where you have lots of really rural residents. And, particularly if you're in agriculture, this is a real crisis because, if you're in agriculture, you need to have access to spot markets to find out when to do futures contracts and so on. And timing is everything in those markets. And, despite what Trump says, 5G doesn't fix any of this. 5G is super local and it needs lots of fiber backhaul. And so you need lots of towers and lots of fiber, neither of which the carriers have invested in. And so really the only way 5G makes sense is if it's sitting on really well-maintained fiber loops that have been created on by entities that have very long amortization schedules, which is cities, right? Businesses, especially publicly listed businesses, do not invest in infrastructure with 50-year amortization schedules.
Yeah, we had a discussion about Huawei, and we had talked about that about a month ago or so, that we don't have the infrastructure for it. As fast as they're developing this technology, we are a decade behind for the infrastructure for it.
Yeah, I mean, this is like worrying about the race to see who can install more plugs in people's houses while not caring about whether there are wires that connect those houses to the grid, right? Like, if you have a Jenny and you've got plugs in every room, it'll be really convenient provided you can keep topping up the Jenny. But like, it doesn't, a Jenny is not a solution, right? A Jenny is what you do when the power goes out. It's not a plan. And we don't have, the backhaul, right? We don't have effectively the electrification, the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, for the 21st century to run fiber everywhere.
And you're talking about legislation that states are putting in place that are preventing really the breakup of these monopolies, right? We expect government to protect us as citizens, consumers, from monopolistic behavior, but really the legal side of things that are actually protecting these companies. And you've talked a lot recently about the adversarial interoperability and how companies like Facebook are really using laws to further prevent people from and other companies from being able to use their platforms or to be able to bring it to consumers in a more consumer-friendly way.
Yeah, so adversarial interoperability, it's a very old idea in technology. So like a good example would be broadcast television. I actually just finished editing a little essay that I'm going to publish on Monday about this. So broadcast TV had a problem, which was that it was broadcast in major markets, but rural markets were not so hot. And there was a TV salesman in rural Pennsylvania who couldn't sell TVs because no one could receive broadcast signals on the rabbit ears. And so he got together with the other TV salesmen in his town, and they put up a giant antenna, and they ran cables into people's houses. It was called Community Antenna TV, and it was the birth of the cable industry. And they did it without permission from the broadcasters, and the broadcasters sued them. But, on the one hand, lawmakers were like, I'm not really going to take away my voters' primary entertainment system because then they'll never vote for me again. But also, it was a time in which our industrial policy and our courts were far more attuned to the public good than private interests. And so what ended up happening was a compromise where broadcasters can broadcast whatever they want, and cable operators can slurp those broadcast signals in and retransmit them, but they have to pay a statutory fee, a set fee, similar to the set fee that you have to pay if you want to record a song, right? When Sid Vicious recorded My Way, he didn't need Paul Anka's permission. He just paid the set royalty, the mechanical royalty rate, and then he was able to record it. So as tech comes along, this kind of adversarial interoperability is really common. Like, you remember the Switch ads from Apple, where they were like, are you a Microsoft user? It's easier than you ever thought to switch. We have this new suite of tools, the iWork suite, that will read and write the files that were written with Microsoft Office and save them to the hard drive for you. And at the same time, you had projects like Samba, which is an open source free software project that replicates the functionality of Microsoft's SMB networking protocol, which meant that you could put a Mac in a Windows-only shop, and you could connect it to the LAN, and it would work with the printers and the backup drives and do file sharing with the other computers on the LAN. And, this sounds pretty trivial today, but I was a CIO back in the pre-Samba era, and you had two kinds of shops. You had shops that were like Windows shops that maybe did accounting or whatever, and there was one Mac for doing the graphic design, and it had its own printer, its own backup drive, and if you needed to get that person files, you put them on a zip cartridge, or not even a zip cartridge because they were Mac formatted. You put them on floppy disks, right? Or on CDs. You burn them onto CDs and you sneaker netted them over. Or you had Mac-only shops, like graphic design shops, where the accountant would be on a Windows machine with their own printer, their own backup drive, and so on. And so this was squeezing out the Mac, right? The Mac would have disappeared if it wasn't for network compatibility. And so all of these tools, they were once super normal. And when Facebook came along, it had to challenge MySpace. And the way that Facebook challenged MySpace was they made a MySpace bot that you could give your login and password to that would pretend to be you, log into MySpace, get all your waiting messages, put them in your Facebook inbox, let you reply to them, push those replies back to Facebook or to MySpace with a little footer at the bottom that said, I sent this from Facebook. Why are you still using MySpace? So all of this was once really common.
And Facebook would never let anybody do that today to their platform.
Oh, not only wouldn't they let them do it, they've already sued a company into oblivion for doing it. There's a company called Power Ventures that made basically exactly that tool. And Facebook advanced this crazy theory that this Ronald Reagan, we're back to Reagan, this Ronald Reagan era law called the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act that was passed in a panic after the release of the Matthew Broderick movie War Games, which is like a true story, that very broadly defines hacking, that it was so broad that it also includes violating terms of service, which means that, again, if you are breaking any of the rules in that sprawling novella of legalese that no one has ever read, that you click I agree to every time you log into any major online service, you potentially commit a jailable felony. Right. And this is, what, if your listeners are familiar with Aaron Swartz, one of the Reddit founders, he was an activist and a scholar and a technologist, and he had gone to MIT where he was allowed to be. He was a Harvard fellow. So he'd gone to campus at MIT. He'd logged into their network, which he was allowed to do. And he downloaded scholarly articles from their repositories, which he was also allowed to do. But he violated the terms of service, which said that you could only download them by clicking on individual links. And instead he wrote a script to do it. And so he was downloading them in bulk. And he was charged with 13 felonies and was facing 35 years in prison. And he eventually hanged himself because the prosecutor dragged out the prosecution until all the money he'd made selling Reddit, his stake in Reddit, was used up. And when he was broke, he hanged himself. And, he was a fellow Chicagoan. And the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act has now been stretched by Facebook to cover terms of service violations, which means that we all now face the same kind of liability that Aaron faced when he was charged with his 13 felonies.
Well, coming off Monopolies and now on to terms of service, that kind of brings us into a subject we've been talking about a lot as far as in their right to ban people because they are their own platform. They have their terms of services and, they hold these monopolies and they are the only way for YouTubers to get out. So one of the stories we talked about for a couple of weeks was one that just made me laugh constantly was a Instagram model selling her own bathwater. And because she profited off this so much, eventually Instagram ended up banning her from her account with 4-point-something million followers, based on the fact that they said she broke the terms of service, but never went into any detail on what she actually did. She wasn't nude in any of these things. It feels like that once that you make a certain monetary value of yourself and don't give access to these platforms to have their cut, they just find a way to ban you and they claim terms of service every time. Do you see that being a similar situation with what's going on in all these companies? They put people behind paywalls. I know that you put out a tweet. That not everyone of your Twitter followers is going to see that tweet, just based on algorithms and things like that. How do you feel about shadow banning and these bans that they do on their platforms?
So I think although you say this is a terms of service question, it's really a monopoly question, right? The problem isn't that someone has a service and doesn't want to extend it to everyone. I think, most of us would say that that's pretty reasonable. If I've got a message board for talking about cats and you want to come on and how much we all love cats and you want to come on and talk about how delicious cats are to eat, I think most of us would say, it's okay for me to say, I'm sorry, you're not allowed to hang out on my community anymore. The problem is when the community becomes the only way to communicate. And so, the Instagram model can sound ridiculous because she's selling bathwater, and really, who cares if she can have her bathwater racket? But as we say in legal circles and policy circles, hard cases make bad law. And so the cases that seem frivolous can set up the precedents or the norms that end up harming people who have much less frivolous cases.
Yeah, and that's the fear. It's the Instagram bathwater salesman today, but I own my own small electrical company. It's my electrical business tomorrow. And that's the fear.
And I'll tell you where it's really bad is in Cambodia. So in 2013, the dictator of Cambodia nearly lost an election thanks to a movement on Facebook to unseat him. And the lesson he took away from that was that he had to really master Facebook. And so he hired some consultants, and they really mastered all of Facebook's rules. And Facebook is basically the only way Cambodians talk to each other online. It is almost synonymous with the internet in Cambodia. And so what he did was he set up this system where if you criticize the government and you don't use your real name, he rats you out to Facebook for violating their real names policy, and they knock you off and you cease to have a platform for criticizing the government. If you do use your real name, the police come and arrest you and torture you. Right? So this is the problem with terms being enforced either religiously or, inconsistently. Both of those can create real problems, but only because the bad decisions that are made, or even the good decisions that are made by the individuals responsible, end up redounding to lots and lots of people. And the thing is that although I'm not a great fan of Mark Zuckerberg, and I think that he has very poor judgment in lots of domains, I don't want to replace Mark Zuckerberg with someone who's smarter than Mark Zuckerberg, because there is nobody on earth who is smart enough to be in charge of making the final decisions for all of the social lives of 2.3 billion people.
Right.
If you think about what it means to be in charge of 2.3 billion people, that means 2,300 one in a million instances every day, right? And no one can support 2,300 one in a million use cases every single day. No one can get that right. And so there's an alternative to this, right? And the alternative to this is called federation, where instead of just having one Facebook where everyone talks, or having a million Facebooks where you have to choose which Facebook you want to be on based on who's there, you have lots of Facebooks that all have local rules, and you choose the one that suits you best. And one of the things that makes you choose the one that suits you best is whether or not the rules about who it federates with suit you, like when it blocks someone else from connecting to them. So I'll give you an example of that. I have a friend who draws or writes comics for DC, and she does some super amazing, great work in major superhero titles that are kind of feminist inflected and really smart. And she's brilliant in every way. And there's about 100 really terrible sociopathic dudes who hate women who draw comic or write comics, and they torment her and the people who are around her, this small group of, a couple of dozen women who are very prominent in comics. And they figured out how to game Twitter's rules. So what they do is they DM these women horrible, threatening messages, wait until they've read them, and then delete them, because they know that Twitter won't let you submit screenshots to their anti-harassment program. And then they post things in public timelines that are really gross, but only if you know what was in the private message. And so they're able to harass these women with messages that don't look harassing to Twitter's enforcement mechanism. Now, this is one of those 1 in a million cases, or 20 in a million cases. And although I would like Twitter to do a better job of it, I mean, I could also see these 20 or so women either setting up their own server or opting into a rival server, either one that's free or one that they pay for or one that's run as a cooperative, that server would scrape Twitter for all the messages waiting for them, the same way that Facebook had a scraper that did that. And then it would filter them, right? It would let them do their own collective block lists or come up with their own rules for which messages would be blocked at the gateway with Twitter. Now, we might say to Twitter as part of an antitrust investigation or consent decree, we require you to support federation through these protocols, the same way that like AT&T has to support third-party long-distance carriers that adhere to a certain protocol. But that should be the floor. The ceiling should be that if I write a bot that logs into Twitter to help Twitter users get more out of Twitter, and we don't break any laws, right? We don't steal other people's data. We're not, committing hate crimes. We're not infringing copyright. We're not, trafficking in the images of sexual assault of children or whatever. If we're not breaking a law, if we're just breaking the terms of service to let people launch a competitive service that lets them use Twitter better, if we're doing it on behalf of bona fide Twitter users, then Twitter can try and block us, but they can't sue us. That we should have, like there's a whistleblower's defense, we should have an interoperator's defense that allows us to plug new services into old services without needing permission from the old service to gore their ox, because they will never give that permission.
Yeah, to me, technology was always supposed to help society, and it feels like we are shifting it to where technology is only going to benefit a small portion of society greatly, and a greater portion of society, very, minutely. It's a dangerous path, I think, that we're heading down, and it's hard to try to step in front of that train that's rolling down the tracks to try to slow it down. Do you feel?
Well, there's a technical name for that situation you just described. It's corruption. Right? Corruption is the concentration of benefits and the diffusion of costs. So, I dump poison into the water supply because it saves me money on filtering my effluent from my factory, and I save money, and all those benefits go into my pocket, and everyone downstream has to buy filters. And so their costs are diffused. They have to solve the collective action problem of getting everyone together and saying, like, okay, well, rather than spending $5 on a filter, we're all going to spend $50 on a lobbyist to fight that company. Whereas I have so much excess profit from my corruption that I can always defeat them in public policy forums. It's just corruption.
You being a big advocate in this realm, from a consumer standpoint, there seems to be very little that we can do. And I know that there's a lot that needs to be done. And I know you're heading out to Burning Man soon, and there you're going to be speaking about Andrew Wang, the EFF lawsuit there. Do you see that that's really where it needs to be? It needs to be attacked at this kind of governmental break up some of these laws that have existed, like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act.
Yeah, as you allude to, Electronic Frontier Foundation, we're suing the U.S. government on behalf of two pretty eminent computer scientists, technologists. One's Matthew Green at Johns Hopkins University, and the other is Andrew Bunny Huang, who is an adjunct at the MIT Media Lab, where I'm a research affiliate. And we're representing them in a lawsuit to overturn the part of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act that makes it illegal to bypass DRM, even if you don't violate copyright law in so doing, which is what allows companies to use DRM to force you to use their products in ways that are profitable for them instead of good for you. And that is one of the major routes that we're going to use to check this power. And it is a huge leverage point, right? Impact litigation, right? Like suing to change the law by making reference to the Constitution is a really powerful tool for beating back bad policies because although litigation is expensive, it's a lot cheaper than lobbying. But it really is only one of the tools that we have in our toolbox. And Lawrence Lessig, who used to be on EFF's board and co-founded Creative Commons, a super smart guy, and was actually the special master in the Microsoft antitrust lawsuit in the 90s, Lessig says that our world is regulated by four forces. Code, that's what's technologically possible. Law, that's what's legal. Norms, what's socially acceptable. And markets, what's profitable. And all four of these work together to affect change. So, if we make it legal for cities to start ISPs that compete with the monopolists, then we can vote with our dollars by subscribing to those ISPs. So we can use law to open up markets. As we open up those markets, we can talk to our friends who think that it's impossible to have phone companies run by the public sector, and we can say normatively, I used to be a Charter subscriber. Let me tell you how amazing it is to not have to do business with Charter and just use my city's 100 gigabit fiber loop instead. And so we can have normative discussions, and we can make technological changes, right? So like if we clear the way for adversarial interoperability by overturning section 1201 of the DMCA, then people will be able to make products that unlock the products you've already bought, that let you use third-party fruit in your Juicero and third-party cars in your car engine, parts in your car engine, and use third-party repair services for your iPhone, right? And so by using these in a cycle, right? By using one to create play in another domain and using that free space, that play we get in the other domain to pry the door open a little wider, one little bit at a time, like you do when you're trying to push something big and heavy and kind of, not very rigid up a hill. Like imagine trying to push like a giant beanbag chair up a hill. You got one corner up and that gives you the space to run around to the other corner and push there. And then you can push in the middle a little and then you can go back to the corner you were on. That one little corner at a time, that way allows us all to work together because we all have different areas of expertise, right? You might be a great coder, but not know how to lobby. So yeah, you should send letters to your lawmaker. You should get on EFF's mailing list, and call your lawmaker when key junctures come up. But what we really need you to do is write code that gives people freedom, right? Well, you might not be a great coder, but you might be the person that the people in your family turn to when they're looking for advice on whether to use Facebook or whether to make their business dependent on Twitter. You can explain this stuff to them, right? You can make a normative change. So, we have these different paths that all ascend the same gradient towards the same summit. And sometimes the path will be steeper and you can cross over onto a parallel path and you can ascend from there and then go back to the path that you were on before, the one that's best suited to you. But we're all headed up the hill to the same summit.
That's a very good way to look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. Love that. And to be respectful of your time and I know we could continue to ask questions, and I know you could continue to articulate in a very profound way on all of these topics. But at this point, I think we'll have to call this one a closed out conversation. But Cory, we truly are fans of both your work, and then we admire the activism and what you're doing and what you're bringing to light. And that's what really we're hoping to do a little further today is just, hey, we're taking our Star Wars nerds and Marvel nerds and we talk about, pop culture on our weekly segment, but we love to have these conversations and try to take that same audience and, maybe shift into that normative side to where these are things that we should be talking about. Maybe we don't have solutions, but maybe these are things that we should just have in our frontal lobe at some point in time. And I appreciate the conversation and you providing us such a depth of information.
Well, thank you. It was a real treat and an honor to be back on, and that approach where we're doing it all at the same time. We're doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and we're bringing our politics into our fandom and our fandom into our politics. I think it's how we win. That we find our common cause.
Yeah, I often say, that we're not trying to just speak about what's going on in pop culture, and that if you are a nerd and we have all these common interests, that, we need to be aware of the things that are in our nerd realm, but affect us in our daily life. We all use the internet. We all stream, we all video game, we all, have these things. And if you're oblivious to a lot of the subjects we talked about today, one day you're going to turn on your Xbox and things just won't be the same anymore. Or you're going to log in to start a new business, start a new website, and things just won't be the way they were 5, 10, 15 years ago. And we need to get in front of that freight train and start to slow it down and get it back on the right track.
Or, you're going to wake up one day and find that the Monopoly no-bid contract with Pearson Education or Houghton Mifflin that your kid's school struck to provide the learnware also gathered tons of shady data on your kid, and now they just breached it. And so all this stuff, from your kid's childhood is now
that's the one subject we did get a chance to touch on that I had the question for still is the fact of selling our metadata and everything that we sign these terms of services and we don't read them. And that's one excuse for people to say they got us. Well, you signed it. You didn't have to sign it. But we also have companies like Experian who none of us have signed terms of agreements with. Yeah. You know, I have a relationship with my Visa card. I don't have a relationship with Experian, yet they're selling all my purchase data, all my, you know, all that metadata, yet we have no agreement. How is that even legal? How is that allowed in our society?
It's really easy. If you don't want to be like on facial recognition systems, just don't have a face. And if you don't want to be like tracked by Experian, just don't be alive or spend any money or have a job or live anywhere. And then Experian won't track you. And it's just as easy as that. And like, again, like if you don't have the gumption to be born in 1971, you don't belong in the computer industry. And honestly, if you insist on having a face, then you have nothing to complain about when the facial recognition industry is tracking you everywhere you go.
We have great interest in these subjects, and we really appreciate you coming on. Anytime you have anything that you're willing to promote, you know, you come. We did the book review for Radicalized. You could go check that out on the nerdcantina.com.
Oh, thank you.
And yeah, anything in the future that you want our audience to reach out to, you just shoot us an email, and we'll be glad to do this again anytime.
Oh, that's great. You know, guys, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your week. I'll be thinking of you as I inhale mouthfuls of gypsum dust and roast in the blazing sun while a van drives by me blasting EDM next week on the plane.
I'll be in downtown Chicago surrounded by horrible economists.
Oh yeah, there you go. Good luck with that. Yeah. All right, give him a kick in the pants for me. Talk to you later.
Thanks very much. All right, nerds. I hope you enjoyed. We hope you enjoyed that conversation with Cory Doctorow. We have been looking forward to this for some time now, and it didn't disappoint as far as what our intent of the conversation was, and our personal curiosities of conversations we just wanted to have.
Yeah, I'm a quite a large man. I don't get intimidated that often, and it is. I walked into this conversation with heavy intellectual intimidation.
Oh yeah. We're sparring outside of our weight class with Cory Doctorow for sure, and you know it wasn't a combative thing, but you know there's still need to be some back and forth, and hopefully we did the conversation justice, keeping it going. But Cory is an encyclopedia of knowledge himself, and really he is so involved in these communities and so passionate about it, and it comes out in the way he speaks and the knowledge that he has, and we're so humbled by the fact that he was able to have this conversation with us.
So yeah, our goal was to take some of the philosophies that he has and his thoughts and relate them to some of the past stories that we've been talking about on the show, because we have been talking a lot about the Instagram bans, the digital rights, the copyright issues and things like that. So when we reached out to him, it was kind of our intent was to have an expert revisit a lot of the subjects you guys have listened to over the last 2 months. And we hope that he was able to give you some more expertise and align them in a way that you see them affecting you in your everyday life, so that at some point you maybe think about these issues and become, like you said, part of the team pushing that beanbag up that hill.
Yeah, and I loved the end. He so well articulated kind of, some of the thoughts and things that we've discussed in the past as far as how do you affect change going forward. And he talked about, the 4 elements that kind of manage or manipulate society, being, code, law, norms, and markets. And I sure as hell can't do law. I can't code.
I can't code.
I have no impact on markets other than the few dollars I spend, which will never make change. Norms. That's one of the reasons why we wanted to do the podcast in the first place. If you go back to our episode 0 intro to who we are and what we were trying to accomplish, it was just to have a community, to have people to have these conversations with, to further this. And whether you care about this or not, before today's conversation, hopefully you care a little bit about it today, or you had your eyes open to some of the monopolistic behaviors that are taking place that are affecting your choices as a consumer, where you really sometimes just don't have choice. And we should.
Let's all be real. If we could all get rid of fucking Comcast, we would.
Yeah.
All right. Let's be legit. Anybody that lives on this side of the country, if you are a Comcast customer, the day that you can bring that cable box in and give them that double fuck you on the way out, it's going to be a good day for you. And that's what he's essentially fighting for, is to give us more of that consumer power, to be able to tell a Comcast to eat a dick, to tell AT&T, I want unlimited data. I don't want you slowing me down. I'm paying you good money. Give me the products that we deserve. So he's trying to put some of that power back in your hands.
So the goal is, if any of this interests you, and you want to be a part of kind of bringing this to the forefront and maybe making effectual change somewhere down the line, hey, let's make this a societal norm. Please share this episode with anybody else that you think might find this interesting, that might have their eyes opened a little bit, or maybe somebody who's on the fringe of already kind of understanding some of this, and listen to Cory talk, and then go and listen to other speeches that Cory's given. He's given talks in the TEDx format, as well as he's got his dystopian books. They're science fiction books, but they pose good questions in both Little Brother and the follow-on Homeland. Radicalized, 4 great stories that hit on a lot of these topics that we discussed today. And then he's got future works coming out, a follow-on novel to Homeland in that Little Brother series. He also has a podcast that you can find on his website, craphound.com, which are his readings of short essays and writings that he does. And I find them to be, again, eye-opening and kind of just further my understanding of really this world that we're living in.
Yeah, don't just be a cog in the wheel. Don't just become complacent with the way things are. We're all going to wake up one day and really regret not taking the initiative when the red flags were going up. And I think that after today's conversation, he raised enough red flags for you to care about at least one of these issues. So.
Well, yeah, and you could tell he's a dystopian writer, because every time we posed a question, he was able to take it to a darker, deeper, seedier level than we were able to come up with ourselves.
You thought it was bad. I'm gonna let you know how bad it really is.
So,
no, today was a great day. Like Ken said, we were really looking forward to this talk all week. I've been getting nerves coming up to this date, going over some of these topics, doing some research just to be prepared for this, because I knew he was going to come in hard, man. He goes hard in the paint on these subjects, so it was really nerve-wracking to be prepared for this.
Well, what we'll ask is, following this episode, please support the Nerd Cantina by liking or subscribing on whatever podcast players. But also go and support Cory Doctorow. Support EFF, which is doing great work in the electronic space and providing us some great overhead cover there on issues that we're concerned with. So sign up for the email blast. Be alerted to the next time that there's maybe some legislation you should be paying attention to, as EFF is doing good work.
You know, I mean, you sign Chuck Norris petitions, you might as well put your digital signature on a petition that is actually doing some good in the world. So sign up for those email lists, and anytime you see some of those things where all you have to do is click a couple links, maybe, do your part.
All right. Well, that takes us out for today. And thanks again for listening. And we'll talk to you again next time, nerds.
See you, nerds.
Real quick, we just wanted to mention one of our favorite new apps, which is Podcoin. So assuming that because you're listening to our podcast today, that you happen to be a podcasting nerd. And if you are, I can't see any reason why you wouldn't want to get paid for your time.
I'm a big fan of getting paid to do stuff that I do in my daily routine anyways. I sign up for all the rewards programs possible. And with Podcoin, you actually get paid to listen to podcasts. So every minute that goes by that you're listening to your podcast, you are throwing away potential money.
So go ahead, download Podcoin app on either through iTunes or through the Google Play Store. And when you sign up with the promo code Nerd Cantina.
One word. That'll get you 300 free coins towards your account and get you on your way to earning that first reward from either Amazon gift card, Target gift cards, all kinds of things. You could also donate your coins to your favorite charity that they offer. If you're going to be listening to podcasts anyways, you might as well get some free stuff for doing it. So download the Podcoin app, put in the code the Nerd Cantina, get your free coins, and start earning money while you listen to our show.